well, we can talk about what Ramana said about this as well, and what the scriptures say, and which is the same as what I say, which is basically realization is one. Realization, there are no levels. It's like to continue your metaphor, Jerry, it's like giving birth. You know, you've either given birth or you haven't. There's no halfway house in this. And realization is one. There are no degrees of realization. There are none. There's not really such a thing as realization. It's just a way of talking about it for the teaching. Remember the verbal teachings, Shravana, you're listening to teachings, the verbal teachings, Shravana, Manana, the whole point of it is to get you to abide as the self, to turn within, to be. Not to be this or that, but just to be. And when you realize the self, then it's just the self being the self. You realize this has always been realized. You don't even realize it in words. This has always been realized. It's just, you can't put it into words. That's just the way it's always been. It appears in ignorance that there are different levels of realization. It might seem that Ramana is more realized than someone else, who's more realized than someone else, who's less realized than someone else. There is no Ramana who's realized, really. The body-mind doesn't attain realization, really. It's just the self being the self. There can be different degrees of insight, but that is all on the level of ignorance, on the level of objects. So Ramana said, realization is one. There are only levels of ignorance. So you can have thick, dense ignorance. And then you can have very fine, subtle ignorance. And the thick, dense ignorance will cause much more suffering, much more delusion, much more distortion than the fine, silky veil of ignorance that's barely there. The distorting capacity of the small, subtle ignorance is very, very little. There's minimal distortion there, minimal suffering there, but it's still ignorance. There's still suffering there. And like that fable of the princess and the pea, if there's just a small amount of suffering there, you will feel like you're suffering. You see? In the fable of the princess and the pea, they were trying to discover who the princess was. And they stacked up those mattresses really high, and they put a pea underneath the bottom mattress. And the princess, who was used to luxury, when she slept on the top, I think it was the 10th mattress, she could feel the pea, and she was like, oh gosh, this bed's uncomfortable. Because she was used to really a high standard of bedding, clearly. And so when our suffering gets less and less and less, it gets finer and finer and finer. Subjectively, to that person, it's still suffering. If you look at that person from somewhere else, you might think, oh, they've got a great life. But from their point of view, they're still suffering. They're still in some sort. So that's like the pregnancy, you see. You could just be pregnant, or you could be almost about to give birth. But you haven't given birth yet in both those cases. You're still suffering, for the analogy. You see? Both those cases. One might be far nearer to liberation than the other. The person who's just conceived, they've got 9 months to go. The person who's on the brink of giving birth, they're about to pop. But they're both ignorant. Different degrees of ignorance only. There's no degree of realization. No degree of realization. So if you see, the reason Ramana has this fullness about him is because he was genuinely realized, let's say. If you've abided as a self for 10, 15 years and it hasn't worked for you, then you might ditch your teachings and say, and you formulate your own teachings. Okay. There's nothing in theory wrong with that. The problem is that the traditional teachings happen to be the correct teachings. If they're the incorrect teachings, then that's good. You're updating an incorrect teaching. And you're saying, look, actually, that teaching doesn't work. What you've now got to do is reintegrate what you've learned from your meditation. But what we have is a traditional teaching that actually works. But people don't go far enough along the teaching to realize it. And then they say, oh, the teaching doesn't work. I've got a better teaching here. But what's actually happening is the ego has taken over and co-opted the teachings and giving a slightly different one. And this is why most of the teachings out there are not like Ramana's teachings. It's because the ego is there. Again, in Vivekachudamani at the end, towards the end, Shankara says, the outer appearance of someone who's realized might be wildly different. You take two people who are realized, figuratively speaking, they could seem to be wildly different, but the realization is the same. It's because you realize the one self. It's very hard to put it into words. It's impossible, really. One self. We don't each have a self that we realize. You see, when you do Shravana Manana only, you recognize your own consciousness, Sat Chit. But you think that you've got your own little bubble of consciousness, someone else has got their own little bubble of consciousness, someone else has got their own little bubble of consciousness. And again, this is how the teachings are distorted. They'll say, yes, you have all your own bubble of consciousness, but in essence, they are one. Just like if you have an apple and someone else has an apple, you can eat your apple, they can eat their apple, but they're the same in essence, they're both apples. They have the same taste, kind of. And this is how the teachings are distorted. It doesn't really feel that great because ignorance hasn't been removed. But when you abide as a self, it's strange to talk about, but there's one self that we all are. There isn't really we. When I say we all are, it's not really we all are. There's just the self. It's just one. So realization can have no degrees because it's just one self. You just realize one self. It's no duality, literally. No duality. So there's no levels. Levels are all in Maya, objects, never in the subject, never in the self.